The late afternoon sun stretched long golden beams across the cracked pavement as Officer Daniel Carter made his way down the sleepy neighborhood street. Willow Creek was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where children played outside until the streetlights flickered on, and where nothing ever truly felt out of place. But today, something was off. Carter felt it in the heavy air, in the quiet that settled between the rustling leaves. It was subtle, but it was there. A weight pressing against his instincts, telling him something was about to shift. A movement caught his eye. Across the street, a little girl sat cross-legged on her front lawn, her blonde hair tied into a single neat braid. Her dolls were arranged in a perfect circle, their plastic faces turned toward one another as if deep in conversation. He had seen her before, maybe once or twice, but had never paid much attention. Until now. Her gaze locked onto him the second he passed, a stare too intense for a child her age. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She just watched. "Hey there," Carter greeted, offering a small nod. He had always made it a point to be friendly to kids, to let them know he was someone they could trust. The girl didn't respond right away. Instead, she tilted her head, her lips curling ever so slightly like she knew something he didn't. Then, in a voice that was soft but strangely deliberate, she said, "I have something for you." Carter hesitated. There was something unsettling about the way she spoke, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She reached beside her into a small wooden box and pulled out a tiny figurine, holding it carefully in both hands. It was an old toy soldier, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. She extended it toward him, her fingers clutching it tightly. "It's special," she whispered. Carter took a slow step forward, watching her carefully before reaching out. His fingers brushed against hers as he took the soldier from her palm, and in that moment, a strange sensation crept over him. The weight was wrong. It was too heavy for its size, the plastic cold against his skin. A strange, creeping unease tightened around his chest as he turned it over, his breath catching the moment he saw the back. A symbol was carved into the toy's surface, faint but unmistakable. Carter's stomach lurched. He had seen this before. For a split second, his mind was no longer in Willow Creek. He was a boy again, crouched behind a rusted metal trash bin, the night air thick with smoke. The crackling of fire, the distant sound of glass shattering, his father's voice calling his name before being swallowed by the chaos. And there in the dirt beside him was this same soldier, half buried in ash. His pulse thundered in his ears as he snapped back to the present. His grip on the figurine loosened just slightly, but he couldn't bring himself to drop it. Slowly, he looked at the girl again, expecting confusion, maybe an innocent smile. But she only watched him, her expression unreadable. "Do you like it?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Carter swallowed hard, forcing himself to steady his breathing. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just a toy. It was a message, a relic from a past he had spent years trying to forget. "But how?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Where did you get this?" The girl shrugged. "My grandpa gave it to me before he died." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, but there was something unsettling about the way she said it, as if the weight of those words carried more meaning than she let on. Carter's fingers curled around the toy, his grip tightening. "Your grandpa?" He kept his tone steady, though his mind raced. "What was his name?" The girl paused, almost like she was deciding whether or not to answer. Then, in that same soft, knowing voice, she said, "Raymond Delaney." Carter felt the name hit him like a punch to the gut. Raymond Delaney. He knew that name. Everyone in law enforcement who had studied hate crime cases knew that name. Delaney had been a leader in one of the most notorious white supremacist groups in the country decades ago. He had orchestrated a string of violent attacks, had destroyed lives, had left entire communities in fear, including Carter's own. A cold wave of realization crashed over him. This wasn't random. This wasn't some innocent child handing him a toy. This was something else entirely. The past wasn't just haunting him. It had just reached out and placed itself directly in his hands. His breath came slow and deliberate as he forced himself to remain composed. "Thank you," he said carefully, slipping the toy into his pocket. The girl nodded, satisfied. "You're welcome." Carter turned and walked away, but he could feel her eyes on his back the entire time. He didn't need to look to know she was still watching. And for the first time in a long time, Officer Daniel Carter felt something he hadn't expected. Fear. If this story sent chills down your spine, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's uncover the truth together. The world around Officer Daniel Carter blurred into the background. The street, the houses, the warmth of the setting sun. All of it faded as he stared at the tiny insignia etched into the plastic soldier resting in his palm. His grip tightened. A familiar dread settled in his chest. The past had never truly left him. It had just been waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now it had arrived, wrapped in the innocent hands of a child. A voice cut through his thoughts. "Officer?" Carter blinked, snapping back to the present. The girl was still watching him, her head tilted slightly. There was something calculated about the way she studied him, like she was waiting for his reaction. He forced himself to breathe. "Where did your grandfather get this?" She shrugged, swinging her legs idly as if the answer didn't matter. "It was always his. He told me it was important." Her voice was soft, almost playful. "He said one day I'd understand why." A chill ran down Carter's spine. He knew exactly what that meant. Memories he had buried deep clawed their way back. The heat of the flames, the acrid smoke burning his lungs, the sound of his father shouting his name, "Daniel, run," before the fire consumed everything. He had been too young to understand back then. But later, he had learned the truth. His family had been targeted. Their home had been set ablaze in a hate-fueled attack orchestrated by Raymond Delaney's men. And now, Delaney's granddaughter sat before him, speaking in riddles, holding a relic of the same ideology that had destroyed Carter's world. He exhaled slowly. "Your grandfather? What else did he tell you?" The girl smiled. "He said there used to be a time when things were better." Carter clenched his jaw. He had heard that phrase before, used by men who longed for a past built on division and fear. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he knelt to meet her eye level. "And what do you think he meant by that?" She blinked, as if the question had never occurred to her. "I don't know," she admitted, her small fingers brushing the hem of her dress. Then, after a pause, she added, "But he said people like you took everything from him." The words hit Carter like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just repeating stories. She was repeating a belief, a dangerous, twisted belief, passed down like an inheritance. His breath came slow and measured. He had spent years facing people like Delaney, fighting against the hatred they spread. But this was different. This wasn't a man in a riot. This wasn't a criminal with a manifesto. This was an 8-year-old girl, and she had already been given a version of the world that was poisoned. A door creaked open. Carter turned, his muscles tensing as a woman stepped onto the porch. Karen Delaney. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze unreadable. "Emily," she called, her voice clipped. "Come inside." The girl lingered for a second before slipping off the porch steps and running inside, the screen door slamming shut behind her. Carter straightened, his pulse still hammering. "Miss Delaney." She didn't move. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carter studied her. She looked tired, guarded. There was no surprise in her expression, no confusion about why he was standing there. She had known. She had let it happen. His fingers twitched at his sides. He wanted to ask, how much did she know? How much had she told her daughter? But something about the way she held herself, the tightness in her posture, told him he wouldn't get the truth that easily. Instead, he pulled the soldier from his pocket and held it up. "Did you know she had this?" Karen's eyes flickered to the toy, but her expression didn't change. If she was nervous, she hid it well. "It's just an old toy." Carter scoffed. "You and I both know it's not." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, Karen sighed, rubbing her temple. "My father gave it to her before he died," she admitted. "He told her it was special." Carter felt his jaw tighten. "Special?" he repeated. "That's what we're calling it now?" Karen exhaled sharply, stepping down from the porch. "Look, officer, I didn't ask for this conversation. My father's gone. Whatever he believed, it died with him." Carter shook his head. "Did it?" He glanced toward the house. "Because I just had a conversation with your daughter, and I can tell you, his beliefs are still very much alive." A flicker of something crossed Karen's face. Guilt? Fear? It was gone before he could be sure. She turned toward the door, gripping the handle. "I need to get back inside." Carter took a step closer, lowering his voice. Karen, she's just a kid, but kids don't come up with things like this on their own. She hesitated. For the first time, Carter saw the cracks in her armor. She's not him, she said quietly. Not yet. Karen's knuckles whitened around the doorknob. Good night, officer. She slipped inside, the lock clicking into place. Carter exhaled. His muscles were tight, his thoughts racing. He had come here expecting a mystery. He hadn't expected to walk into a battle for a child's future. His fingers brushed against the toy soldier in his pocket. Raymond Delaney may have been buried, but his legacy was still breathing. And Carter wasn't about to let it grow. The air inside the squad car felt thick, heavy, as Officer Daniel Carter sat motionless in the driver's seat. The toy soldier rested in his palm, its weight pressing down on him like an anchor. He traced his thumb over the tiny emblem on its back, the carved insignia that had upended everything. Raymond Delaney. The name alone was enough to send a slow burn through his veins. He had spent his career chasing men who carried the same ideology, had arrested them, testified against them. But this was different. A child had handed him this soldier, a child who had no idea, or maybe she did. Carter exhaled, running a hand down his face before reaching for the car's onboard computer. The screen flickered to life, the glow illuminating the tension in his jaw as he typed in the name. Delaney, Raymond. The file loaded almost instantly. Carter's eyes moved quickly over the words, his pulse steady but heavy. Arrested 1984. Charges: arson, aggravated assault, hate crime. Released 1999. No further convictions. Deceased 2016. Carter clenched his jaw. Released. That word burned in his mind. A man like Delaney didn't just stop being dangerous. He might have died a free man, but his ideology had likely lived on. Had it reached Emily? He scrolled further, searching for family records. The cursor blinked, then more text appeared. Survived by Karen Delaney, daughter. Emily Delaney, granddaughter. Karen. His mind flashed back to earlier that day. Her standing at the doorway, silent, watching as her daughter spoke. She had known. When Emily handed him the toy, Karen hadn't been surprised. She had let it happen. His fingers tightened against the keyboard as he stared at the screen. Emily wasn't just a little girl with an old soldier toy. She was being raised in the shadow of a man who had destroyed lives. And now, that shadow had found its way back to Carter. His phone buzzed against the dashboard. The sudden vibration made him tense. He reached for it, glancing at the caller ID. Detective Sean Turner. Carter swiped to answer. Yeah. You're working late, Turner said, his voice casual but knowing. Saw your car outside. Everything good? Carter's eyes flicked to the house across the street. The porch light was on now, casting a soft glow over the front yard. Through the sheer curtains, two figures stood inside. Emily and her mother. He exhaled. I need you to run a deeper check on Karen Delaney. Prison visits, financial records, anything that connects her to Raymond Delaney after his release. There was a pause. You think she was involved in his activities? I don't know yet, Carter admitted, but I'm not letting this go. Turner sighed on the other end. I'll see what I can find, but if you're digging into Delaney's past, be careful. The line went dead. Carter sat there for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the wheel. Then, movement in the house caught his eye. Karen. She stood by the window, one arm crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed outside. Fixed on him. Their eyes locked. Neither of them looked away. Then, slowly, she reached for the curtain and pulled it shut. Carter exhaled sharply. That confirmed it. She knew. A familiar weight settled in his chest. He had seen this before. Parents passing down hate like it was inheritance, teaching their kids without ever saying the words out loud. They hid it in bedtime stories, in casual remarks, in the way they reacted to people who looked different. Hate wasn't always shouted. Sometimes it was whispered, and Emily had been listening. His grip tightened around the steering wheel. He wasn't going to let history repeat itself. Tomorrow, he would come back. Tomorrow, he would have a conversation that needed to happen. The morning air was crisp as Officer Daniel Carter sat in his squad car outside the Delaney house. The town was just waking up. Cars pulling out of driveways, joggers making their usual rounds, but Carter barely noticed. His focus was on the house in front of him. The toy soldier rested on the passenger seat beside him, its plastic surface catching the weak morning light. He had spent most of the night staring at it, unable to shake the weight of what it represented. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a warning from years ago. Some symbols never die. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he replayed last night's encounter. The way Karen had looked at him from the window, the way she had pulled the curtain shut. It wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper. Carter stepped out of the car, the toy soldier still clutched in his palm. Each step up the driveway felt heavier than it should have. He knocked. A long pause. Then soft footsteps. The door cracked open just enough for Karen Delaney's face to appear. She looked exhausted, her hair loosely tied back, dark circles under her eyes, but more than that, she looked wary. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice unreadable. "What brings you back so early?" Carter held up the toy soldier, watching her reaction closely. "We need to talk," he said. Karen's eyes flickered to the toy. For a split second, something passed through her expression, something close to regret. Then, just as quickly, her face hardened. "It's just a toy," she said flatly. Carter shook his head. "You and I both know it's not." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Karen sighed and stepped aside. "Come in," she said quietly. Carter entered, scanning the space. The house was neat, almost too neat, as if it had been carefully arranged for appearances. Family photos lined the walls, school awards placed meticulously on shelves. It looked normal. But Carter had seen enough homes like this to know that hate didn't always leave visible marks. Karen motioned toward the kitchen table. "Sit." Carter didn't. He kept his stance firm, holding up the toy again. "I need to know where this came from," he said, "and I need to know what you've been teaching your daughter." Karen crossed her arms. "It was my father's. He gave it to Emily before he died. That's all it is to her, a toy her grandfather gave her." Carter scoffed. "That's not what she told me." Karen's jaw tightened. "She said he told her it was special," Carter continued, "that one day she'd understand why." Karen exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. "I didn't want this for her," she muttered. Carter studied her carefully. "Then why didn't you stop it?" Her silence was answer enough. Karen let out a bitter laugh. "You think it's that simple?" she said. "That I can just erase everything he put in her head?" Carter took a step closer. "You can try." Karen shook her head. "He spent years with her, Carter. Years telling her stories, making sure she saw the world through his eyes. By the time I realized how deep it ran, it was too late." Carter's grip tightened around the toy. "It's never too late." Karen looked away, her hands gripping the back of a chair. "You don't get it," she whispered. "Then make me understand." A long silence filled the room. Then finally Karen exhaled shakily. "My father was sick toward the end," she admitted, "but his mind was still sharp. He knew what he was doing." Carter felt something cold settle in his chest. "And you let him?" Karen's gaze snapped to his. "You think I had a choice?" Her voice was raw now, almost desperate. "You think I didn't try to push back? Every time I told Emily something different, he told her I was wrong. He had her convinced that I didn't understand." Carter's fingers curled around the toy. He had seen this before. Hate passed down like a family heirloom, wrapped in stories and bedtime whispers. It didn't have to be shouted. It just had to be planted like a seed, waiting for the right moment to grow. Karen ran a hand through her hair. "I never wanted this," she said softly. Carter studied her. For the first time he saw the war in her eyes, the guilt, the fear, the helplessness. "You asked if I could help her," he said finally. "That depends on you." Karen swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know how," she admitted. "You start by telling her the truth," Carter said. Karen let out a weak laugh. "And what if she doesn't believe me?" Carter exhaled. "Then you show her something else." The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then, soft footsteps echoed down the hall. Carter turned. Emily stood in the doorway, her small frame bathed in the dim morning light. She wasn't smiling now. Her eyes flicked between her mother and Carter, quiet but sharp, as if she knew they were talking about her. Carter straightened, keeping his expression calm. "Hey, Emily," he said. She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze flickered to the toy soldier still clutched in Carter's hand. Carter followed her stare. He could see it clearly now, not just as a toy, but as a test, a symbol, a piece of something much bigger than it seemed. Emily's fingers twitched at her sides. "Are you mad at me?" she asked finally. Carter hesitated. He could feel Karen watching him, waiting for his response. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to Emily's level. No, he said honestly. I just want to understand. Emily blinked at him, her face unreadable. Then, after a beat, she smiled. And for the first time since arriving at this house, Carter felt a slow chill creep down his spine. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward as Officer Daniel Carter kept his eyes on Emily. Her words echoed in his mind, sharp and deliberate. You were part of the reason everything got taken away from us. She didn't blink, didn't fidget. Most kids her age would have been nervous under his gaze. But Emily, she stood firm, waiting, as if she wanted to see how he would react. Carter took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. What do you think that means, Emily? The little girl hesitated, her fingers curling at the hem of her dress. For the first time something flickered in her eyes. Not defiance, not certainty, doubt. She glanced at Karen as if searching for reassurance, but her mother said nothing, her face pale and tight with tension. Carter leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Did your grandpa ever tell you why he thought that? Emily frowned. He said there used to be a time when things were better. Carter nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He had heard that phrase before, too many times. And what do you think he meant by that? Emily's small shoulders lifted in a shrug. I don't know. That was something. A crack. Small, but real. Karen exhaled shakily, her grip tightening around the chair beside her. She looked at her daughter, eyes pleading. Sweetheart, did Grandpa ever tell you everything that happened? Emily frowned deeper, shifting her weight. He said people like us used to have more. Carter exchanged a glance with Karen. She looked stricken, as if hearing her father's words repeated out loud made them more real. He turned back to Emily. More of what? Emily hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she shook her head. I don't know. The words were quiet, uncertain. Carter saw it then, the hesitation creeping into her expression. The slow unraveling of something she had never questioned before. Karen stepped forward cautiously. Baby, sometimes, when people tell stories, they leave things out. They only tell the parts they want us to hear. Emily blinked up at her. But Grandpa wouldn't lie to me. Carter stayed quiet, letting the moment settle. Karen swallowed hard, her voice softer now. I know, sweetheart. I know he loved you. But sometimes people believe things that aren't true. And when they tell those stories, they make themselves the hero. Emily's hands fidgeted. Grandpa was the hero. Carter exhaled slowly. Are you sure? Emily's breath hitched. She looked between them, her mind working, her small brows furrowing deeper. Then, for the first time since he had arrived, she looked scared. Not of him, not of her mother, but of the idea that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Karen knelt in front of her daughter, eyes shining with unshed tears. Sweetheart, there's so much I should have told you before, and I will. But right now, I need you to ask yourself something. She reached for Emily's hands, squeezing them gently. If Grandpa was wrong about some things, could he have been wrong about this too? Emily's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked at Carter, her wide eyes searching his face. He didn't push. He didn't say anything at all. He just waited. And then, finally, Emily spoke. I don't know. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough. Karen let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her mouth. Carter could see the relief in her eyes, the way her body sagged slightly. It wasn't over. Not yet. But it was a start. Carter straightened, slipping his hands into his pockets. She's going to have questions, he told Karen. She's going to push back. But she's listening, even if she doesn't realize it yet. Karen nodded quickly, as if she already knew that. Maybe she did. Emily was quiet, staring at the floor. Then, after a long moment, she looked up at Carter again. Are you still mad at me? Carter knelt slightly so they were eye level. I was never mad, he said honestly. I just wanted to understand. Emily held his gaze, then gave a small nod. Karen wiped at her eyes, looking more hopeful than she had before. Carter took one last glance at the toy soldier sitting on the table. It had been a message once, a symbol of something old and ugly. But now, it was just a toy. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The silence in the room was thick, stretching between them like an invisible barrier. Officer Daniel Carter could still feel the weight of Emily's stare, the way her small fingers had twitched at her sides. She wasn't afraid of him, that much was clear. But there was something else there now. Uncertainty. She had been so sure of the stories her grandfather had told her. And now, for the first time, she wasn't. Karen ran a hand down her face, exhaling shakily. "I've tried talking to her," she admitted, voice raw. "I've tried telling her that what my father believed in was wrong, but she doesn't listen. She thinks I'm the one who doesn't understand." Carter studied her carefully, because he got to her first. Karen's breath hitched, but she didn't argue. Carter had seen this before. He knew how it worked. They planted ideas in children when they were too young to question them. They wrapped hate in stories that felt like history, disguised prejudice as wisdom. And by the time the kids were old enough to think for themselves, the roots had already taken hold. Emily was 8, old enough to absorb, young enough to unlearn. Karen's voice broke the silence. "She's 8, Carter." Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. How does a child that young already believe in something so hateful? Carter thought about his own childhood, about the stories his father had told him, but they had been about strength, about kindness, about standing up for what was right. "She wasn't born like this," he said quietly. "She was taught." Karen let out a bitter laugh. "You make it sound like I could just fix this overnight." "No," Carter admitted, "but you can start." Karen looked at him then, eyes tired, desperate. "How?" Carter exhaled, measuring his words. "By taking a stand." Karen let out a weak, humorless chuckle. "And what if I already lost her?" Carter shook his head. "You haven't." Emily shifted on her feet, gaze flicking between them. She wasn't just listening, she was watching. Karen ran a shaky hand through her hair. "Every time I tried to tell her something different, my father would twist it around. He'd tell her I was wrong, that I didn't understand the real world, and she believed him." She swallowed hard. "She still does." Carter's fingers curled into a fist. He had seen this kind of manipulation before. But hearing it like this, seeing the toll it had taken, made his blood simmer. "You're her mother," he said firmly. "She's looking to you now." Karen's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "And if I can't change her mind?" Carter hesitated. He could see the war happening in her. Fear, doubt, guilt. But there was something else too, a sliver of hope buried beneath all the regret. "You don't give up," he said. Karen let out a slow, shaky breath. The house was quiet now, too quiet. Then, soft footsteps. "Emily." She stepped forward, eyes still locked onto Carter. But this time there was no small smile, no quiet, knowing look. She hesitated. Carter crouched slightly, bringing himself to her level. "Emily," he said carefully, "why did you give me that toy?" Emily's small fingers twisted the hem of her dress. For the first time, she looked uncertain. "Because Grandpa said you'd understand." Carter's chest tightened. There it was, the confirmation of what he had feared. Raymond Delaney hadn't just given her that toy, he had sent a message through her. And Emily, this innocent-looking child with wide, observant eyes, had delivered it without even realizing how deep its meaning went. Carter forced his voice to stay calm. "What else did he tell you?" Emily hesitated. Then, in a quiet, almost secretive voice, she answered, "He said you were part of the reason everything got taken away from us." Karen flinched. Carter didn't react. He just held Emily's gaze, steady and unshaken. Her words confirmed everything. Delaney's influence wasn't gone. It was alive, and it was sitting right in front of him. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward as Officer Daniel Carter kept his eyes on Emily. Her words echoed in his mind, sharp and deliberate. "You were part of the reason everything got taken away from us." She didn't blink, didn't fidget. Most kids her age would have been nervous under his gaze. But Emily, she stood firm, waiting, as if she wanted to see how he would react. Carter took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "What do you think that means, Emily?" The little girl hesitated, her fingers curling at the hem of her dress. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not defiance, not certainty, doubt. She glanced at Karen as if searching for reassurance. But her mother said nothing, her face pale and tight with tension. Carter leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Did your grandpa ever tell you why he thought that?" Emily frowned. "He said there used to be a time when things were better." Carter nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He had heard that phrase before, too many times. "And what do you think he meant by that?" Emily's small shoulders lifted in a shrug. "I don't know. That was something. A crack. Small, but real." Karen exhaled shakily, her grip tightening around the chair beside her. She looked at her daughter, eyes pleading. "Sweetheart, did Grandpa ever tell you everything that happened?" Emily frowned deeper, shifting her weight. He said people like us used to have more. Carter exchanged a glance with Karen. She looked stricken, as if hearing her father's words repeated out loud made them more real. He turned back to Emily. More of what? Emily hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she shook her head. I don't know. The words were quiet, uncertain. Carter saw it then, the hesitation creeping into her expression. The slow unraveling of something she had never questioned before. Karen stepped forward cautiously. Baby, sometimes, when people tell stories, they leave things out. They only tell the parts they want us to hear. Emily blinked up at her. But Grandpa wouldn't lie to me. Carter stayed quiet, letting the moment settle. Karen swallowed hard, her voice softer now. I know, sweetheart. I know he loved you. But sometimes people believe things that aren't true. And when they tell those stories, they make themselves the hero. Emily's hands fidgeted. Grandpa was the hero. Carter exhaled slowly. Are you sure? Emily's breath hitched. She looked between them, her mind working, her small brows furrowing deeper. Then, for the first time since he had arrived, she looked scared. Not of him, not of her mother, but of the idea that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Karen knelt in front of her daughter, eyes shining with unshed tears. Sweetheart, there's so much I should have told you before, and I will. But right now, I need you to ask yourself something. She reached for Emily's hands, squeezing them gently. If Grandpa was wrong about some things, could he have been wrong about this too? Emily's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked at Carter, her wide eyes searching his face. He didn't push. He didn't say anything at all. He just waited. And then, finally, Emily spoke. I don't know. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough. Karen let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her mouth. Carter could see the relief in her eyes, the way her body sagged slightly. It wasn't over. Not yet. But it was a start. Carter straightened, slipping his hands into his pockets. She's going to have questions, he told Karen. She's going to push back. But she's listening, even if she doesn't realize it yet. Karen nodded quickly, as if she already knew that. Maybe she did. Emily was quiet, staring at the floor. Then, after a long moment, she looked up at Carter again. Are you still mad at me? Carter knelt slightly so they were eye level. I was never mad, he said honestly. I just wanted to understand. Emily held his gaze, then gave a small nod. Karen wiped at her eyes, looking more hopeful than she had before. Carter took one last glance at the toy soldier sitting on the table. It had been a message once, a symbol of something old and ugly. But now, it was just a toy. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Emily sat on the couch, legs tucked under her, fingers twisting in the hem of her dress. The living room felt quieter than before, the air heavy with unspoken words. Officer Daniel Carter remained near the doorway, watching her carefully. Karen sat beside her daughter, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at Emily, then at Carter, as if waiting for him to say something. But he didn't. This moment wasn't his to control. Emily had to make the next move. The little girl's gaze flickered toward the toy soldier still sitting on the coffee table. Its dull plastic surface reflected the warm glow of the lamp beside it. It was small, harmless looking, but it had carried a weight that none of them had been prepared for. Finally, Emily spoke. If Grandpa was wrong, does that mean he was a bad person? Karen inhaled sharply, her grip tightening. Carter felt something twist in his chest. He knew how hard that question was. Children saw the world in absolutes, good or bad, right or wrong. But the truth, it was always messier than that. Karen opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Carter knelt slightly, lowering himself to Emily's eye level. It means he was a person, he said gently. And sometimes people believe in things that hurt others, even if they don't think they're wrong. Emily frowned, absorbing his words. Karen let out a shaky breath. Sweetheart, your grandpa loved you. That was real. But some of the things he believed, they weren't. Emily looked between them, her small fingers curling into fists. But he told me we were supposed to be proud. Carter's throat tightened. He had heard that before. That was how it started. Not with hate, not with violence, but with pride. With belonging. With the idea that you had to protect something that was being taken from you. He exhaled slowly. Being proud of where you come from isn't bad, Emily, but thinking it makes you better than someone else? That's different. Emily blinked up at him, confusion flickering in her expression. But Grandpa said people like you ruined everything. Karen's breath caught. Carter didn't flinch. He let the words settle, let the weight of them sit between them before speaking again. What do you think, Emily? The question seemed to shake her. Her fingers twitched again, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came out, because she didn't know. Carter could see it happening, the slow, painful unraveling of something she had never questioned before. Karen wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. I should have said something sooner. Carter met her gaze. But you're saying it now. Emily exhaled, her shoulders sinking. I don't know what to believe anymore. Carter nodded, his voice soft but firm. That's okay. Emily looked at him, startled. Karen frowned slightly. It is? Carter nodded again. It means she's thinking. He turned back to Emily. And thinking for yourself? That's how you figure out what's true. Emily chewed on her bottom lip, processing. Karen took a slow breath. Baby, I know this is hard, but you don't have to believe something just because someone told you to. Emily hesitated, then looked at Carter again. Then how do I know what's right? Carter held her gaze. You listen, you ask questions, and you decide for yourself. The room was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, Emily reached forward and picked up the toy soldier. She turned it over in her hands, staring at the emblem carved into its back. Carter watched her carefully. Emily's fingers trembled slightly before she set the toy back down on the table. And then she let go. Karen let out a breath she had been holding, her shoulders sagging in relief. Carter straightened, watching Emily closely. He knew this wasn't the end. There would be more questions, more doubts, more moments where she would struggle between what she had been taught and what she was learning now. But she had taken the first step. And sometimes that was enough. Emily sat in silence, her hands resting in her lap. The toy soldier remained on the coffee table, untouched. The weight of the conversation lingered in the air, thick and unshaken. Officer Daniel Carter could see the conflict on her face, subtle but real. Karen rubbed her temples, exhaustion settling in. I don't know where to go from here, she admitted. I feel like I've already lost too much time. Carter didn't look away from Emily. She's still here, he said. You haven't lost her. Emily's fingers twitched slightly, but she said nothing. Karen swallowed hard, then turned toward her daughter. Sweetheart, I know this is a lot, and I know you loved Grandpa, but I need you to really think about something. Her voice softened. Did he ever tell you why he thought things were better before? Emily frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. Karen continued gently. Did he ever explain what was taken from him? Emily's small hands curled into fists, as if trying to grasp something just out of reach. He just said people like us lost things, she muttered. Carter leaned forward slightly. Like what? Emily didn't answer. Karen's breath hitched. Sweetheart, do you see what I mean? He never told you what was taken. Just that it was. Emily's brow furrowed, frustration creeping into her expression. But he wouldn't lie to me. Karen hesitated, then carefully reached for her daughter's hands. I know, baby, but what if he believed in something that wasn't true? Emily stared at her mother, uncertainty flashing in her young eyes. Carter exhaled slowly. You ever hear a story about a hero, Emily? She nodded hesitantly. And in every story, the hero thinks they're doing the right thing, don't they? Another nod. But sometimes, Carter continued, keeping his voice calm, the hero isn't really the hero. Sometimes, they think they're fighting for something good, but they're actually hurting people. Emily's breath came a little faster, as if something inside her was unraveling too fast for her to catch. That's not Grandpa, she whispered. Karen's face crumpled. Sweetheart, I know that's hard to hear, but you have to be willing to ask the question. Emily's small hands trembled. But he said we were special. Carter's chest tightened. That was the trap. That was how it started. They didn't tell kids to hate outright. They made them feel important. Carter kept his tone steady. You are special, Emily, but so is everyone else. Emily blinked rapidly, her mind struggling against the walls that had been carefully built around it. Karen held her daughter's hands tighter. Baby, I don't want you to be afraid to ask questions. I don't want you to believe something just because someone told you to. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. I don't know what to believe. Karen pulled her into a tight hug, her voice breaking. That's okay, she whispered. You don't have to know everything right now. You just have to be willing to learn. Carter watched, silent, letting the moment settle. Then slowly, Emily pulled away. She looked down at the toy soldier one more time. And then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Karen wiped at her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. I don't know if this is enough. Carter stood, his gaze following Emily as she disappeared down the hall. It's a start. Karen swallowed hard. How do I keep this going? Carter met her eyes. You show her something different. Karen nodded, as if committing to it. She wasn't just saying the words anymore. She meant them. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Officer Daniel Carter stood near the door, his gaze lingering on the hallway where Emily had disappeared. He could still hear the faint sound of her footsteps, the slight creak of a floorboard as she moved. She hadn't said a word since walking away, and Karen hadn't followed. She needed time. Karen wiped at her eyes and let out a long, uneven breath. I should go after her. Carter shook his head. Not yet. Karen hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. I don't know what to do, she admitted. What if she hates me for this? Carter studied her. She doesn't hate you, Karen. She's confused. There's a difference. Karen pressed a hand against her forehead. I let this happen. I let him fill her head with all this, and I didn't stop it. Her voice broke slightly, and now I might have ruined everything. Carter kept his tone steady. You didn't ruin anything. You're trying to fix it. Karen let out a bitter laugh. What if it's too late? Carter exhaled. Then why is she still listening? Karen's breath caught. Because she was listening. Even if Emily didn't know what to believe right now, she hadn't shut down completely. That mattered. Carter walked over to the coffee table and picked up the toy soldier. He turned it over in his palm, his thumb brushing over the carved emblem. It was just plastic, just a symbol. But symbols carried weight. They carried history. And sometimes they carried lies. He set it back down. She needs to see something different. Karen blinked. What do you mean? Carter met her gaze. She grew up hearing one version of the world. You need to show her another one. Karen swallowed hard. I don't even know where to start. A soft noise made them both turn. Emily stood at the edge of the hallway, her small frame half hidden behind the doorframe. Her eyes flickered between them, uncertain. Karen took a step forward. Sweetheart? Emily hesitated. Then, slowly, she walked back into the room. She didn't sit down, she didn't reach for her mother's hand, but she came back. Carter saw the hesitation in her body, the way she shifted on her feet. She was here, but she wasn't ready to talk yet. That was okay. Karen knelt in front of her, keeping her voice soft. I know this is hard. Emily's arms wrapped around herself, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. I don't know what to think anymore. Carter stepped closer, his voice gentle. That's okay. Emily looked up at him, searching his face. Really? He nodded. It means you're thinking for yourself. Karen swallowed thickly. Baby, I just want you to have the whole story, not just what Grandpa told you. Emily's lips parted like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Carter took a careful step closer. You ever hear the saying, history is written by the winners? Emily nodded hesitantly. Well, Carter continued, crouching slightly to meet her eyes, sometimes history is also told by people who want to be the winners, even when they weren't. Emily's brow furrowed. You mean, Grandpa? Karen's breath hitched. Carter didn't answer right away. He let the words settle. Then, gently, he said, I mean, anyone who only tells one side of the story. Emily glanced at the toy soldier. She stared at it for a long time, as if seeing it differently now. Then slowly she reached forward. Her small fingers hovered over the plastic before she picked it up. She turned it over in her hands. Then, without a word, she walked toward the trash can in the corner of the room. Karen's breath caught. Carter didn't move, didn't say anything. He just watched. Emily stood there for a long moment, gripping the soldier tightly. And then, she let go. The plastic hit the bottom of the trash can with a soft, final sound. Karen's hands covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Emily turned back to them, her expression unreadable. I don't want to believe in something that hurts people. Karen let out a shaky breath. You don't have to, baby. Emily looked at Carter. What if I still don't know what to believe? Carter gave her a small nod. Then you ask questions, you learn, and you decide for yourself. Emily seemed to think about that. Then, for the first time, she gave a small nod back. Carter exhaled. She wasn't fully there yet. She might never be. But she had taken a step. And sometimes that was enough. The steady hum of the patrol car's engine filled the quiet street as Officer Daniel Carter sat parked outside the Delaney house. The morning air was crisp, the sky a muted gray, the kind of color that signaled a storm was coming. He hadn't driven away the night before. He couldn't. Instead, he had parked a few blocks down, watching the house from a distance, his thoughts tangled in knots he couldn't untie. Emily had thrown away the toy soldier. That meant something. But was it enough? Carter knew how deep these things ran. A single moment of doubt didn't undo years of whispered lessons, of carefully planted beliefs. He had seen it before. Kids torn between the truth and the only world they had ever known. Some fought to escape it. Some fell right back in. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel. He had told Karen she needed to show Emily something different. That wasn't just her job. It was his too. A soft knock on the window pulled him from his thoughts. Karen stood outside, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her expression uncertain. Carter unlocked the door and she slipped into the passenger seat, exhaling shakily. She didn't sleep, Karen admitted, rubbing her arms. Kept asking me questions, kept second-guessing everything. Carter kept his gaze forward. That's good. Karen let out a humorless laugh. She's confused. She's thinking. Karen fell silent. Carter let out a slow breath. You ask me how to keep this going. That's how. You keep answering her questions. You don't let someone else do it for you. Karen swallowed hard. What if I don't have all the answers? Carter turned to her. Then you find them together. A small, broken laugh slipped from her lips, but there was something almost hopeful in it. She wiped at her face, straightening slightly. I want to do this right, but I don't even know where to start. Carter studied her for a long moment. I have an idea. Karen's brow furrowed, but before she could ask, a small figure appeared at the front door. Emily. She hesitated before stepping outside, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the patrol car like she wasn't sure she wanted to approach. Karen tensed. I should. Carter shook his head. Waitley took a few cautious steps forward, then stopped. Carter opened the driver's side door, stepping out slowly. You coming with me today? He asked. Emily blinked up at him, startled. Where? Carter smiled slightly. Come find out. Karen looked between them, then hesitated. Is this okay? Carter nodded. She needs to see more than just this house, more than what she's been told. Karen hesitated. Then finally she nodded. Emily shuffled forward, still unsure. Where are we going? Carter crouched slightly to her level. Somewhere important. Emily glanced back at her mother, who gave her a small nod. Then hesitantly she followed Carter to the car. The drive was quiet. Emily stared out the window, her fingers tapping absently against her leg. Carter didn't speak. He wanted her to think, to process. When they finally pulled up to the small community center, Emily frowned. What is this place? Carter turned off the engine. Come see. She hesitated, then slowly climbed out. Karen followed, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs. Faces of people from different backgrounds, different lives. Some smiling, some solemn. Emily stepped closer to one of the images, her small fingers barely grazing the frame. Carter watched her carefully. This is a history project we started a few years back. Stories from people who've lived through things most of us can't even imagine. Emily frowned, her gaze lingering on an older man's photograph. Who is he? Carter's voice softened. His name was James Carter, my father. Karen inhaled sharply. Emily turned to look at him, eyes wide. He was a firefighter, Carter continued. Saved lives every single day, until someone decided he didn't deserve to. Emily swallowed hard. What happened to him? Carter met her gaze. Your grandfather's group burned our house down with him still inside. The room went still. Karen let out a quiet gasp, her hand covering her mouth. Emily's breath came faster, her face paling. Carter knelt slightly, his voice even. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Emily. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the whole story. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She glanced at the picture again, then back at him. He didn't deserve that, she whispered. No, Carter agreed. He didn't. Emily looked down at her hands, her breath shaky. Grandpa never told me about this. Carter exhaled. Maybe because he knew it didn't fit the story he wanted you to believe. Emily's lips trembled. I don't want to believe in something that hurts people. Carter gave her a small nod. Then don't. Karen wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Emily sniffled, looking back at the wall of faces. Can I learn more? Carter's chest tightened. Yeah, kid, he said quietly. You can. For the first time, Emily took a step forward on her own, and Carter knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The drive back was quiet. Emily sat in the back seat, staring out the window, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Karen sat beside her, silent, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse. Officer Daniel Carter kept his eyes on the road, giving them space. No one spoke. Not yet. The community center had done something to Emily. Carter had seen it in her eyes. The moment she looked at the picture of his father, the moment she realized there were pieces of the story her grandfather had never told her. And now, she was processing. Carter pulled up to the house and shifted into park, but neither Karen nor Emily moved. Karen finally broke the silence. Emily, she said gently. Emily didn't look at her. I don't understand. Karen swallowed hard. I know, sweetheart. Emily's voice was quiet. I thought Grandpa was the good guy. Karen reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing gently. He thought he was. Emily shook her head. But he hurt people. Carter finally turned in his seat. That's what happens when people only believe in one version of a story, he said softly. They forget to ask what happens to everyone else. Emily glanced at him, her lips trembling. Grandpa wouldn't lie to me. Carter exhaled. Maybe he didn't think he was lying. Maybe he believed what he told you, but that doesn't make it true. Emily's hands tightened in her lap. I don't know what to do with that. Karen's eyes welled with tears. You don't have to figure it all out today, baby. But what matters is that you're asking the right questions. Emily's breathing hitched slightly, like the weight of it all was pressing down on her chest. It's not fair, she whispered. I trusted him. Karen pulled her into a tight hug, stroking her hair. I know. Carter let the moment settle before speaking again. The truth can be hard, Emily, but what matters is what you do with it. Emily sniffled, pulling back slightly. I don't want to be like him. Karen's voice cracked. You won't be. Emily wiped at her eyes, then hesitated. But what if other people think I am? Carter leaned forward slightly. Then you show them who you really are. Emily looked at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. How? Carter glanced at Karen before answering. By listening, by asking questions, by standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Emily swallowed. Grandpa wouldn't like that. Karen let out a shaky breath. Sweetheart, you don't have to be who he wanted you to be. Emily hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she whispered, I don't know how to be anything else. Karen cupped her daughter's face gently. Then let's figure it out together. The room fell into silence again, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind. This was different, lighter. Carter finally reached for the door handle. You two should get some rest. Karen wiped at her face, nodding. Thank you, she said, voice thick with emotion, for everything. Carter gave a small nod. This isn't the end, Karen. It's just the beginning. She exhaled like she already knew that. Emily watched him carefully. Will you come back? Carter smiled slightly. Yeah, kid, I will. Emily nodded, still uncertain, but there was something different in her eyes now. Something new. And as Carter stepped out into the cool evening air, he knew that was enough. For now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as Officer Daniel Carter stepped out of his patrol car. The Delaney house looked the same as it had a few days ago, quiet, still, as if nothing had changed. But he knew better. Inside, everything was different now. He walked up the driveway, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Karen stood there, arms crossed over her chest, exhaustion lining her face. But there was something else in her expression, something softer. You came back, she said. Carter nodded. I told Emily I would. Karen exhaled, stepping aside. She's in the backyard. Carter walked through the house, the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air. It felt warmer inside than before, less like a place filled with ghosts. As he stepped onto the back porch, he spotted Emily sitting cross-legged in the grass. She was drawing. He approached slowly, hands in his pockets. What are you working on? Emily glanced up, squinting in the sunlight. A new picture? Carter crouched beside her, watching as she carefully shaded in the edges of a blue sky. It wasn't much, just a simple landscape. But there was something important about it. Something deliberate. Karen leaned against the porch railing, watching them from a distance. Emily put down her colored pencil, tilting her head. I was thinking a lot about what you said. Carter kept his voice even. Yeah? She nodded. About how people tell stories in a way that makes them the hero. Carter didn't respond. He let her keep going. Emily traced a finger over the paper, her expression thoughtful. I think Grandpa wanted me to believe his story so bad that he didn't want me to ask questions. Karen sucked in a quiet breath, but she didn't interrupt. Emily looked up at Carter. But now I want to ask. Carter met her gaze. That's good. Emily's fingers fidgeted with the corner of the paper. I don't want to be like him. Karen stepped forward. You don't have to be, sweetheart. Emily chewed on her lip. But what if people still think I am? Carter held her gaze. Then you show them who you really are. Emily hesitated. How? Carter leaned back slightly. By choosing to be different. Every day. Even when it's hard. Emily stared at him, processing. Karen knelt beside her daughter, her voice soft. Baby, the best way to change what people think of you is to change how you think about yourself. Emily swallowed. That's scary. Carter nodded. Yeah, but doing the right thing usually is. Emily picked up a different pencil, pressing the tip against the paper. I want to learn more. Carter felt something settle in his chest. Hope. Karen ran a hand through Emily's hair, smiling faintly. Then we'll learn together. Emily nodded, shading the sky a little darker. Do you think it was always blue? Carter tilted his head. What do you mean? Emily looked up, her young face filled with something much older than she was. I mean, do you think the sky was always blue? Or did someone just tell us it was? Carter let the question hang in the air. Then, finally, he smiled. I think that's something you'll have to decide for yourself. Emily stared at the paper, then back at the sky. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the answer. The wind carried the scent of rain through the backyard, rustling the edges of Emily's drawing as she pressed her palm against the paper to keep it in place. The sky above was shifting, clouds rolling in, but she didn't seem to notice. She was too focused, too deep in thought. Officer Daniel Carter leaned against the porch railing, watching her carefully. There was something different in the way she held herself now, still hesitant, but not in the same way as before. The fear had been replaced with something else, curiosity. Karen stood beside him, arms crossed, her fingers tapping lightly against her sleeve. I don't know what happens next, she admitted quietly, for her, or us. Carter kept his eyes on Emily. She's already changing. Karen let out a slow breath. I'm scared it won't be enough. Carter glanced at her. It won't be. Not right away. Karen exhaled sharply. That's not exactly reassuring. Carter pushed away from the railing, flopped, stepping onto the grass. It's the truth. She spent years believing one thing. You don't undo that overnight. Emily looked up as he approached, her eyes scanning his face. Still thinking about the sky? He asked. She nodded slowly. I just wonder, what if I believed something wrong for a really long time? Carter crouched beside her. Then you learn from it. Emily hesitated. But what if I mess up again? Karen knelt beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then you keep trying. Emily stared at her hands. I don't want people to think I'm like Grandpa. Carter's voice was steady. Then show them who you are. Emily looked down at her drawing again, her fingers tracing the edges of the sky she had colored in. Karen swallowed hard. Would you ever want to talk about him? About what he did? Emily's fingers stilled. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, softly, she said, Maybe. Carter exchanged a glance with Karen. It wasn't much, but it was something. The wind picked up, lifting the paper slightly before Emily pressed it down again. Carter watched her for a moment longer before straightening. I should go. Emily blinked up at him. Are you coming back? Carter gave a small nod. Yet, I am. Emily hesitated. Then, slowly, she offered a small smile. Okay. Karen exhaled, nodding at Carter in quiet gratitude. He turned toward the house, stepping onto the porch. Just as he reached the door, Emily called out behind him. Officer Carter? He turned back. Emily tilted her head. What color do you think the sky was before? Carter studied her, then glanced up at the clouds overhead. The wind carried the scent of rain, the promise of something new. I think, he said slowly, that it was always changing. Emily nodded, considering his answer. And as Carter stepped through the door, he knew that was enough. For now,